Morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Dali Museum. We are very pleased to have you here on this warm day for Coffee with a Curator. And we want to thank Cafe Gala for providing the refreshments for our coffee program. This happens on the first Wednesday of every month. And we are happy that you're all able to join us today. Just to give you a foreshadowing, next month, Jeune, our curator, is going to be talking about our new exhibition that opens at the end of the month, which is Horst P. Horst, a photography show. He was a friend of Dali's and also a part of Vogue for over 6 decades. So it's going to be an amazing show. We hope you'll join us for that. And then in August, I'm going to do a talk on surrealism and photography to tie in with that. So a couple things coming up with the coffee talks. Also, we have our cult classics beginning tomorrow, and it's going to be on the first Thursday of every month. As soon as it gets dark outside, we will start the free movies. Tomorrow we're showing Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Next month we show Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And in August we have Beetlejuice. So if you're looking for some fun that's not very expensive, it's a free event. Definitely we hope you'll be able to join us for those. And then last but not least, just to mention another program we have every Saturday at 1 o'clock. We have our Dali and Beyond film series. We are doing in June and July free family films. So this month we're going to be showing Brad Bird's Iron Giant. We are showing Disney's Up. We're going to show Jumanji. And the last week we were showing Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky. So if any of those sound enjoyable, or if you know of children looking for things to do, Saturdays at 1 o'clock, we have some great films in June and July this month. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, which is Margo Hammond. Many of you are very familiar with Margo. She's been a journalist for 4 decades. Many of those years was spent at the St. Pete Times as the book editor. She is a colleague of ours here at the museum, and she worked on our memoir writing workshop, which a number of you have attended. She is also a blogger. She was part of the Book Babes, along with Ellen Hetzel. They have a book published, Between the Covers, The Book Babes Guide to Women's Reading Pleasures. I'm sure many of you have that sitting by the bedside. And she is also the founder of the Times Festival of Reading. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Margo. If not, you are in for a treat, and she's going to be talking about collectors today. So please join me in welcoming Margo Hammond.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming out. And my topic, as you can see, is modern art and its collectors. Can everybody hear my voice? Okay. This topic, I got to get my computer adjusted here. This topic actually came about because of the Dali literary salon. And we read this book, In Montmartre. So I want to give a shout out to Peggy Silverglide and her literary salon. There she is. Because we've read some very interesting books in that in the salon. And in this book, I was asked to find something in the book to present to the class or to the group. And I noticed that there was some very, very interesting stories about these early modern art collectors. And I think that the subject is very underreported. So I gave this little talk, and we decided that this would make a more interesting, expanded talk for the Coffee with the Curator. So this was a period very early on that spanned from 1900 to 1910. The figure of the collector, more attractive the longer one observes it, has not been given its due attention thus far. One would imagine no figure more tempting to the romantic storytellers. Now that was Walter Benjamin back in the 40s that said that. And I think it's really still kind of true that the role of the collector is very underreported. And I hope by the end of this talk that those of you who have $200 million in your pocket will think about being collectors and maybe even donating to the Dali Museum. Benjamin was so interested in collectors that he wrote a book about one who is a very obscure collector now, Edward Fuchs, who is also a historian. But the art collector hasn't fared too well in popular culture. I looked for the figure in various books, and I came up with Steve Martin's book, another book that we read for the literary salon. And this was one of the quotes. She started converting objects of beauty into objects of value. So this was kind of art collector as shameless careerists. I found another book where the art collector was a failed artist. And he surrounded himself with artwork, and this was the quote I found from there. Hanging paintings on every square inch of the walls I thought would make my house look like the Paris house of Gertrude Stein. We'll come back to Gertrude Stein, but it was kind of this attempt to associate yourself with the greats, but he wasn't. Then I looked at movies, and I found the art collector as social climber, and this was in Boogie Woogie, which is, by the way, named after a Mondrian painting. And this was one of the reviews of it. Bob and Jean Mackliston seemed to use art collecting as a way to score new lovers. So not a really flattering. This was even less flattering. The greedy capitalist of Gordon Gekko in Wall Street. This painting here, he's telling one of his colleagues, I bought 10 years ago for $60,000. I could sell it today for, I think that's supposed to be 60,000, or maybe not, 600,000. Yeah, 600,000. The illusion has become real, and the more real it becomes, the more desperate they want it, capitalism at its finest. You'll discover that that painting that he was talking about would be a steal now at 600,000. And then the last movie I found was this scene in the Basquiat studio. The art buyer, who was played by Tatum O'Neal, a kind of snobby socialite, said, I don't know, I just don't know if I can live with the green. And Basquiat, who's played by Jeffrey Wright, says, get a fucking director. Excuse my language. So really in pop culture, art collectors don't look very good. But there has become a new appreciation for this role in recent years. And this was from this history professor and Frick Museum advisor, Anne Higanet. Collectors were as important to the whole process of modernism as those who made the art, because they transformed how we saw old art. Now, she's probably more interested in the masters, but they did found at the Frick a Center for the History of Collecting in America. And again, they mostly emphasize older collectors of older paintings, but more and more we're recognizing the collectors that are collecting now. One of the reasons why certain works of art survives that specific individuals cared enough about them to recognize their value. And you'll see as we go through all of these different collectors over the decades that they made a huge impact on who got collected, made a huge impact on who we think is great now. So the early modern collectors, I thought that there was some thread that ran through them all. They all seemed to be outsiders. They were definitely all art addicts. In fact, Peggy Guggenheim was even called herself an art addict. They all formed these intensely personal relationships with the artists. And their portrait was painted almost incessantly by these artists. And you'll see that, I don't know to flatter them, but it's an interesting story in itself, the history of collectors' portraits. And most surprising to me, they weren't all wealthy. So we start in Paris in 1894, because I start with Ambrose Vollard, who was an art collector, but he was also notably a dealer, publisher, and biographer. Now, when I started looking into this, I wondered, what is really the difference between an art collector and a dealer? A dealer collects art, but he or she collects it to sell it. And collectors, in a way, collect it to sell it or to donate it. So sometimes there's a thin line, and in Vollard's case, that was a very thin line between those roles. He was born and raised in the West Indies. In 1894, he opened an art gallery on the Rue Lafitte in Paris, and he gave Cézanne his first show. This is one of the portraits Cézanne did of him, and you'll see lots of portraits of Vollard. He also collected this amazing list of artists: Monet, Manet, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Degas, Renoir, Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso, Rouault, Derain, and the Fauves. Not too shabby. His relationship with Cézanne was remarkable. He said, an innovator like Cézanne was considered a madman or an imposter, and even the avant-garde regarded him with contempt. On the spot, I managed to buy 150 canvases from him, almost his entire output. I didn't even have enough money left over to frame the canvases decently. So he wasn't a wealthy man, but he had a tremendous eye. He also was a tremendous promoter of the artists he liked. So he wrote a book about Cézanne. I said he was a biographer. So now the book sold, and now Cézanne rose in importance. And of course, he used his portrait on the cover. He had an amazing relationship with Renoir. In a letter, Renoir addressed him as "to my sympathetic slave driver," because many times Vollard would commission pieces, or he would find people who wanted some particular subject matter, and he would go to his artists and get them to paint. Here's a biography he did of Renoir. So again, he was promoting his own authors. He had a relationship with Matisse, a very close one. And this was one thing he did that this was repeated later on among artists, is he sold Cézanne's painting to Matisse. So collects one guy and then sells it to another guy. And he gave Matisse his first solo exhibit. He also had a relationship with Picasso. He gave Picasso his first Paris show. He purchased pieces from his early periods, his blue and rose periods. And when he purchased that, it was because the Steins had got interested in his later periods. So Vollard realized if the Steins were interested, he would collect the ones from the early ones and make a killing. So then he mounts a retrospective of Picasso's early work right at the height of when he's into a different period, the Cubist period. In 1910, Picasso was looking for a primary dealer, and so he painted Vollard's portrait. This was very common if a painter wanted to attract the attention of a collector or a dealer. This is what Vollard said. He said the portrait was notable. 3 years later, he sold it to the collector Sergei SHCHUKIN, which we'll learn about later, but he never agrees to be his dealer. And this is somebody who says that the Demoiselles d'Avignon was the work of a madman. So you think, well, he really doesn't like Picasso? No. He promotes Picasso. He commissions him to illustrate several books. He includes him in his art books. And he, very importantly, links Picasso with Cézanne. So the circle is complete. And this is what Picasso said about him: "The most beautiful woman who ever lived has never had her portrait painted, drawn, or engraved any oftener than Vollard." And you'll see that he shamelessly had his portrait painted by all these great artists. There he is. He put those on his cover. There he is with his cat, Bernard. Bernard also with his cat. Even Picasso painted him in the late 30s with his cat. So what happened to Vollard's collection? In 1939, he was in an accident. Now, I said he was a dealer, so was he not really an art collector? Well, he ended up having 10,000 pieces of art when he died. So that means he certainly, if he was hoarding them for money, he was hoarding a lot of paintings. So some of them he must have wanted for his own collection. 560 paintings were sent to the US, 200 were put in a Paris vault, and the rest were sent to Yugoslavia, and those still have not been cataloged, and it's still under litigation who owns them. In 1979, the Paris Bank vault was opened, and all these amazing paintings were found, and they had an auction, and they were auctioned off for 30 million euros. This is one of the ones that was sold, a Derain. Now, the next of this period is, as I promised, Sergei SHCHUKIN. He was a Russian textile merchant. Now, why was he an outsider, as I said? And I'll tell you why. Because he went to Paris in 1897. Now, he was a merchant. So he was not a part of the upper class, the aristocratic class in Russia at the time. And yet he amassed 258 avant-garde paintings, and he hung them in his palace in Moscow, which then he opened to the public. Now, he was wealthy. He was the exception to these three that I'm going to talk about during this period. He had a lot of money. And this is a picture of the paintings that he hung. And the reason why I say he's an outsider is because he lived in Moscow. And it would be like, I don't know, maybe here living in an industrial city in the United States, not living in New York or Los Angeles, or maybe Cleveland, let's say. And still having the eye to collect wonderful paintings. So the aristocracy in Russia aligned with the Paris aristocracy, and they hated these new guys, the post-impressionists, the impressionists, the cubists. They called them lunatics and monkeys, and they should be sent back to school. SHCHUKIN instead looked at paintings and followed his own eye and his own passions. And he ended up with this collection 13 Monets, 3 Renoirs, 8 Cézannes, 4 Van Goghs, 16 Gauguins, 39 Henri Rousseaus, and 16 Derains. 37 Matisses, some of which he actually commissioned, like this one and that one. 51 Picassos, and he had a whole room dedicated just to Picassos in his palace. He met Matisse in 1906, and he became the artist's main patron. And I wanted to tell this anecdote about how he approached these artists. Like I said, they were these early patrons really became friends with these artists and supported them. In 1908, he was on a business trip to Paris. He met up with Matisse, and he really liked this painting, and it was called Harmony in Blue, and he bought it. But before Matisse shipped it to him, Matisse changed his mind and decided he wanted to change the colors on it. So he sent it to him and changed the title because now it was Harmony in Red. He completely changed the colors, but SHCHUKIN didn't care. He was so loyal to Matisse and Matisse's own vision. SHCHUKIN and Picasso, when he started to collect Picassos, he collected very key pieces from that early period and major landscapes, which other people weren't collecting at the time. He also collected some of his Cubist art. There again, another room in his mansion that was just filled with Cubist art. But it's interesting about SHCHUKIN why he chose certain paintings. And you have to look into his personal life to see what he was driven by. And unfortunately, in his case, he was really driven by lots of tragedies that affected his life, which is why he ended up collecting the very depressing pictures of Picasso. In 1905, one of his twin sons committed suicide. In 1907, his wife died. In 1908, his brother committed suicide. In 1910, his second son committed suicide. And no wonder he bought these paintings with skulls and very sad motifs and started collecting early depressing Picassos. But of course, it paid off in the sense of being masterpieces of later years. But you have to put him in the context. He was in Tsarist Russia. And this was a very hard time for somebody who was an aristocrat. So the question is, how did a Muscovite from a conservative and prominent merchant class, an unprepossessing man with an uncontrollable stutter, become the favorite patron of Matisse and Picasso? And the Pushkin Museum director said, such a collector could appear only in a country that awaited a revolution. So in some ways, he was the product of the turmoil that was happening in his own country. And he said, if a picture gives you a psychological shock, buy it. It's a good one. Another portrait painted by an artist of him. What happened to the SHCHUKIN'S collection? In 1918, Lenin appropriated his collection. He escaped to Paris, where he died in 1936. After all, he was an aristocrat. He wasn't going to join the revolution. His mansion in Moscow became the State Museum of New Western Art. Then later, in the 40s, 48, Stalin closed the museum. And I like this. He called it a bourgeois cosmopolitan and wrongly oriented artworks, but he didn't destroy them. He divided them between the Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts and the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, where they still reside and are some of the most visited paintings in the world. So the next group, the Steins. Now, this is a whole family of collectors. There's Gertrude, Leo, and Sarah, all having their portraits painted. We'll get to that, but you can see that they were the three. Now, Sarah was married to Michael, who was the actual brother. She was a sister-in-law, but these were the three collectors in the family. This is a family portrait. I want you to note the little boy in the picture because he comes up a little bit later. They were outsiders. They were a Jewish-American family from San Francisco. They had, they weren't poor, but they by no means SHCHUKIN-level wealth. They had inherited money from cable cars and rental property back in San Francisco. So Gertrude Stein said, you can either buy clothes or buy pictures. So she used her money to buy pictures. Sarah and Michael, these are the portraits that Matisse did of them. And these were the portraits that Picasso did of Gertrude and her brother Leo. Leo arrived in Paris in 1903. Gertrude followed quickly after that. Leo started with buying Cézannes, but they were kind of expensive and Renoirs at the time. This one he bought for 8,000 francs, which would be $40,000 today. Again, this painting would be pretty priceless by today's standards. Then they pooled their resources, Leo and Gertrude, and they started buying affordable art. Now, affordable art at the time meant the artists nobody else wanted to buy. So they went to the Salon d'Automne, where the fauves were, this was a derogatory term that was used for these new paintings. And Leo called this particular painting the nastiest smear of paint. It took him 5 weeks to decide to buy it. He bought it for 500 francs, which was about $500 at the time. Leo introduced Matisse to his sister-in-law and brother, and she became a Matisse supporter. And the family had kind of a rivalry of who was buying whom. And this is the boy I told you about in the picture. Matisse painted their son, Alan. Sarah and Michael said, treat the artists you love like family, and they did. They would have Matisse over for dinner at 58 Rue Madame, and he was part of the family. And these are some of the paintings they bought. And you'll see, if you take a look at these paintings, you'll see them on the wall later on in their houses. So I liked this anecdote because it tells you a little bit more about VOLLARD'S methods. Sarah wanted to buy this painting, Boy Leading a Horse by Picasso. And so Vollard went over to the Bateau Le Voir to see what Picasso would sell it for. So Picasso said, I want 20 francs. And Vollard said, you must be mad. And then Picasso said, all right, 15. So Vollard got these things for very cheap and then resold them to the Steins for a lot more money. He also encouraged both of his people who were in his group of artists to paint the same subjects. So in this case, Matisse did a coiffure, and so did Picasso. This is another painting that they sold, that the Steins bought. This is a very interesting story because you'll see later when I tell you what happened to the Stein collection. This was the portrait of Gertrude Stein, the famous portrait by Picasso. She sat reportedly more than 90 times for this portrait. She would go down up to the Bateau Loire. They lived in the Latin Quarter. But people think maybe that was just in competition to Vollard, who claimed he sat for his portrait of Cézanne. So there was a little competition among collectors. And I love this story. When someone said that it didn't look like Stein, Picasso said, it will, or she will. Then there's also the idea that these collectors put these artists together. They would not have met each other if it weren't for these collectors. So Matisse was introduced to Pablo, or Henri was introduced to Pablo, by Gertrude Stein. So she took him up there, and they became lifelong rivals, friends, a little bit of both. In the fall of 1907, they followed along with Vollard's idea of swapping paintings, or in this case, swapping paintings or buying paintings from rivals. This was two paintings that were swapped. And reportedly, Picasso put up Matisse's painting in his studio, and it was used as a dartboard. But that has been a little bit, I mean, a lot of people told that story, I think, just to whip up the rivalry between those artists. They actually had great regard for each other and obviously influenced each other as well. Now, this is the famous Rue de Fleuris, where the Steins lived, Leo and Gertrude lived. Leo said, critics come to mock and remain to pray. That was his famous statement about all of these paintings. Now you can see there's the nasty smear of paint that they have on the wall. On the left there is the Picasso that I showed you earlier. And what I love about these photographs is that you see these paintings sort of willy-nilly. There's the portrait of Gertrude just up on the wall among a bunch of other paintings. And when you see there's the boy leading the horse. So they just slap them up on their walls like almost like a museum. But they also moved them around because now you see the portrait of Gertrude a little bit lower. And so when they bought a new painting, they rearranged their walls. But it must have been quite a sight for people to come in and go to the salons there and be surrounded by all this art. So in 1910, Alice B. Toklas moves in with Gertrude and Leo. In 1913, Leo moves out, not because of Alice, but because he couldn't stand Picasso's Cubist period, and he couldn't stand Gertrude's writing. So he took 16 Renoirs and a Cézanne, and Gertrude kept the Picassos. I leave it to you to decide who got the better of the deal there. And there's Gertrude and Alice B. Tolkien, again, in their salon. Gertrude Stein gave advice to Ernest Hemingway: buy the people of your own age. There are always good, new, serious painters. And we'll see that later on in the collectors, the more recent collectors, that's what they're doing. Oops. So that's a plaque on the Rue de Fleuris. It says, here lived Gertrude Stein. Here she lived with her brother Leo Stein, and then later with Alice B. Toklas. And it's here where she received a number of artists and writers from 1903 to 1938. So what happened to the Stein collection? That artwork was dispersed on 5 continents and sold to public and private collections. And the Picasso portrait of Gertrude that I told you about that she sat for was the only one she willed to a museum. Gertrude was not stupid. She knew that she would become famous in New York when that portrait was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, one of the most visited paintings in the museum. So now the art scene after, as the war started heating up, started to shift to New York. First of all, the war drove many European artists to New York, and because of that, American modernism, which had been collected by some, began to attract even more collectors. So one of the persons who straddled those two worlds was Peggy Guggenheim. She was an American collector that had started her collecting on the European continent. She had a wealthy father who died on the Titanic. Her first husband was a Dadaist. And in 1921, she met Brancusi, Duchamp, and Barnes in Paris. So she had pretty high Tony company. She had a decade. Her real strong collecting was a decade, from the 38 to 48. In 38, she opens the Guggenheim Jeune in London. Her first show was with Jean Cocteau, her second show with Kandinsky. In 39, she started to buy a picture a day. She was very wealthy. And she bought Picabia, Braque, Dali, and Mondrian. This was the Dali that she bought. Then she opened a museum, a gallery, with her husband. Then she eventually married Max Ernst. She opened this gallery called The Art of This Century, very much emphasizing the art of the time. Now, again, modern art, we use the word contemporary art, modern art. Contemporary art really should mean the art of now. We've kind of mixed up those terms. Modern art, oftentimes by scholars, is usually starting in those 1800s that I refer to, 1890s, 1860s, Gauguin and Cézanne, up until the 60s. So the term, though, is oftentimes loosely used just as new art. So, but she was really emphasizing that this was the art of this century. That was, of course, the 20th century. And it was a very avant-garde museum in and of itself. There she is with Max Ernst. In 43, she commissions a Pollock mural. Now, this was revolutionary for the time. Pollock was, a young modernist American painter. She ended up donating that mural in '59 to the University of Iowa. She was an early champion of abstract expressionism. So she was an early collector of a lot of American authors, painters who were abstract impressionists. Jackson Pollock, who was inspired by Picasso and Surrealism, and especially his poured paintings. She was very much a proponent of the poured paintings, the ones where, if you saw the movie, he throws the paint on the canvas and swirls it around. Also, she was an early collector of Mark Rothko. In 48, she moved to the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni in the Grand Canal in Venice. There's her with her famous eyeglasses. And in 51, she opened the collection to the public. What happened to the Guggenheim collection? In 69, she showed her collection in New York. The Guggenheim Museum in New York is owned by her uncle. In 70, she donated her palazzo to the Guggenheim Foundation. In 76, she donated the collection to the foundation, and then the foundation assumed the management of all her works when she died in 1979. You'll see this pattern as we go through some of the more recent collectors, that they create foundations to, probably for tax purposes, but also for organization purposes of when their collections become unwieldy or they start museums. So this is what happened to the Peggy Guggenheim collection. It is now a museum in Venice. These are some of the highlights of the collection. She had early Max Ernst, he was her husband after all, René Magritte, Miro, Tanguy, there's the Jackson Pollock. Now, there was another couple that collected during that period of time in the 40s, and they were collecting a single artist, and they lived in Cleveland, which was an odd place to live and collect modern art. And this was the first painting they collected, Eleanor and Reynolds Morse, in 1943. They bought it for $1,250. I think this painting's probably worth a little more than that. The second painting they bought in 43. And what happened to the Morses collection? I think we all know the answer to that. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but I do want to tell you that there were some other collectors of Dali that I wanted to light upon. We'll come a little bit back to the Morses a little later, briefly. But the other Dali collectors I found were Huntington Hartford, Sir James Hammett Dunn and Lady Dunn, and Anne Green. I don't know if you're familiar with any of these. I hadn't been, so I was fascinated with researching this. Huntington Hartford, I want to thank Annette Norwood for this, because she gave me some background on Huntington Hartford. He was the heir to the A&P grocery fortune. He actually went to school with Reynolds Morse. So thank you for your information on that. And he became on the sort of national art scene in 1951 when he published a rant against abstract art, which was all the rage at that time. It was called, "Has God Been Insulted Here?" And he singled out Dali and Picasso for particular ridicule. And as you can see on one side, he's showing he's holding a piece of insulting art, and the other, a portrait of himself, which he thinks is better art. So, but he changed his mind about Dali, or Dali got him to change his mind about Dali. He commissioned Discovery America for the opening of his Gallery of Modern Art in New York's 2 Columbus Circle. I've been in this building many, many times in New York. It now is the Design Museum. If some of you have gone to New York and seen that, I had never knew that this once was a museum of modern art. It was kind of an ill-fated museum. Also in that museum, he had 2 Dalis in the museum and then the rest of his collection. The other Dali that he had in that Columbus Circle was called The Battle of Tetuan. And there's a great story in a biography that I read of Hartford Huntington, in which he describes how Dali got, or the biographer describes how Dali got Hartford Huntington to buy this painting. What he did was he got his dealer to come and cover it with a curtain. And then he positioned Hartford Huntington in front of the painting. And then at the appointed time, Dali, with a great flourish, unveiled the curtain, and Hartford bought it on the spot. So Dali knew how to play this collector, and he also said, Dali has never been presented better. So Dali was great at figuring out how to make these collectors eat out of his hands. So Hartford Huntington had a lot of problems with this museum. First of all, he had a lawsuit with MoMA because he used the term modern art in his title, and they begged to differ because they said that he shouldn't call his. So he had to change the name after the lawsuit to the Gallery of Modern Art, including the Huntington Hartford Collection, a kind of mouthful that cartoons mocked because they, put the name that circled around the building. It was so long. And this particular cartoon from the New Yorker said, you've got the wrong address, Mac, because someone's delivering an abstract painting to his museum. Tom Wolfe called Huntington Hartford the Martin Luther of Columbus Circle, because he said he was a revolutionary against the established idea of what modern art was supposed to be. This was from the Journal of Reginald Morse. Thanks again to Annette. She gave me this. Physically, the strange triangular-shaped building is not structured ever to be a moneymaker, as a conventional museum, and Hartford's collection is fifth rate. Oh, ouch. It was begun too late and with too little and with far too much amateur advice. So Morse didn't think much of Hartford's collecting abilities. And in fact, he didn't do very well and kind of died pretty much in obscurity. The other collector who you may remember, because we had these paintings in the museum a while back when we had that lovely, huge masterpiece of Dali, which was commissioned by the Duns. The Duns, he did portraits of the Duns. I'm not sure that he wasn't having a little bit of fun with Sir James with that portrait as a Roman emperor, and with Lady Dun on the horse. And then this was a curious, another curious portrait that was done by Dali of a patron. Anne Green was part of the original Zodiac group, along with her brother Julian Green. Peter just told me that today, which I was very surprised, because I'm a big fan of Julian Green, a novelist who lived in Paris. And it seems that they were all part of that early fan club, Dali fan club. And this was a picture that he did of her son. Now, as I told you, as the war heated up and European artists were coming to America, people were rediscovering American modernism. But this man, Edward Wales Root, had been collecting it for decades, from 1909, in fact, to 1956. He collected the Ashcan School, the Depression area artists, and the New York School. So it was 5 decades of collecting. He concentrated on American artists. This was a Prendergast that had been shown in the 1913 Armory show that he bought. This is a very early Edward Hopper, a very unusual Edward Hopper, since it's a landscape. He also collected Pollock. And in 1953, the Met displayed his collection, 134 works. It was the first exhibit of a private collection of contemporary art ever at the Met. Oh, and I just wanted to mention, this is a movie, Auspicious Vision, and I want to thank Carolyn Nygren for tipping me off to this collector, because this is a fascinating DVD. I just want to put a plug in here, Peter, for having a week of collector DVDs, because there's a fascinating one on Peggy Guggenheim that I think the museum is obtaining. This one is really fascinating, and you'll see some others as well. So they have done documentaries on some of these collectors. This is Arthur Dove. This is also American modernism. Robert Motherwell, also included in the Root collection. What happened to Root's collection? He bequeathed it, more than 200 20th century American works, to the the Munson Williams Proctor Arts Institute in Utica, New York. And in 1960, Philip Johnson designed an international building to house the collection. This is something else that we start to see, and you're in a building that proves it, that people realized that these collections needed first-rate and modern buildings to show them off. And this was one of the first examples of that. Now, I told you that the term modern sort of ends in the 60s. So now we're really into the postmodern period and postmodern art collectors. And I'll start with the post-60s. Now, keep in mind this little piece. It's Untitled by John Chamberlain, crushed car metal on wood base. So that was a piece from the 60s. And that piece was collected by Dorothy and Herbert Vogel. I like to call them the proletarian art collectors, because talk about not being wealthy. They lived on his postman's salary, and they bought art with her $23,000 a year earnings. They were, throughout the 60s and into the 70s, all over art galleries in New York. They became very famous. They would show up. They were very short. Both of them were very short, and you see pictures of them with these huge, tall models. They became friends with the artists. They went to the artist studios. They bought art for next to nothing in very early periods of these conceptual artists. They crammed the art in their rent-controlled Manhattan apartment, stuffing it under their beds. This one reporter went to interview them and opened the bathroom door, and they had one on the bathroom door. Everywhere they could possibly put them in their apartment. There's also a documentary written about, a DVD, documentary on them, Herb and Dorothy, that's just, I highly recommend it. It's wonderful. Here they are, that's an early portrait of them, and they collected all the way into their old age. What happened to the VOGELS collection? In 1992, they donated, or at least tried to donate the whole collection to the National Gallery of Art. And in the DVD, you'll see that the National Gallery of Art couldn't even take all the stuff they had. I don't know how they even crammed it in this apartment, but it was too big for the National Gallery of Art. So they took part of it. That crushed piece that I showed you, there's a funny part in the DVD where Herb goes over to the table while the curator is amassing all this art, and he says, "Oh, you've got that upside down," and he turns it. It still looked like a crushed piece of car metal, but Herb knew which side it was supposed to be on. And so they took the rest of the art that the National Gallery of Art couldn't take, plus they couldn't stop collecting, so they kept collecting, and they gave 50 works for 50 states. So they started to give works to museums all over the country. And that's another DVD that the same filmmaker did on this particular project, 50 by 50. So then we reached the post-70s. Now, what really marked the 70s and the change of collecting was this one auction. It changed everything. They called it the auction gavel heard round the art world. And it was October 18th, 1973. It was called the Skull Auction. 50 pieces were sold for over $2.2 million. Suddenly, the art had become amazingly sought after and amazingly expensive. Skull, well, actually it was him and his wife, sold their Jasper John ale cans, which they had bought for $960. They sold it for $90,000. A Rauschenberg painting that they had bought for $2,500 at this auction went for $90,000. An Andy Warhol painting that they had bought for $2,500, they sold it for $135,000. They took, of course, all the profits. The paintings were theirs, the auction was theirs. The artists were livid. At a news conference, Robert Rauschenberg accused collectors, Robert and Edith Skull, of infidelity and the auction house of encouraging profiteering. Now, that was the story that had been told down the decades about that famous auction. But it turns out that there was a video, there's always a video, surfaced, and now you can go on YouTube and watch the famous exchange between Rauschenberg and Skull. And it turns out that Rauschenberg knew that this was an opportunity. He suddenly realized his work was worth $135,000 and urged Skull to buy at that price more of his work. So Rauschenberg died in 2008, a very rich man, because what the Skulls did was make art very expensive, and also an investment. So Robert Skull was a New York taxi tycoon, and you'll see a little bit later there's another taxi tycoon that crops up in China. So I don't know what is it about taxi driver or people involved with taxis, but they seem to have some connection with art. He said acquisition is involvement in art, and in art it's probably the most exciting kind of involvement. And here is one of the rare cases where a contemporary artist painted this is Alfred Leslie, painted his patron. This is also another example. Edith Skull became famous for her portrait being painted by Warhol. This was Warhol's first commission portrait, and it was made, he took photographs of her in a photo booth in Times Square. The piece was contested in the Skull's divorce. They divorced in ⁻75, and now it's shared by the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney. Probably for tax purposes, they both got a piece of it. So where are we at today? Let's see what time I have here. Okay. What do we have today in art collectors? Well, I sort of looked at that list again and thought, well, they're both insiders and outsiders. Still got a few outsiders, but actually more insiders. We have lots of savvy investors, but a lot of those savvy investors are also art addicts. They still often formed intensely personal relationships with artists. That hasn't changed. And occasionally they still, as we saw, have their portrait painted. But with few exceptions, they're insanely wealthy. We have Hollywood celebrities, company software designers, football team owners, hedge funders, taxi tycoons, as I mentioned. There's 2 of them, at least I know. Fortune 500 company execs. This was from the Sotheby chief auctioneer. The best art is the most expensive because the market is so smart. So that's what happened to art. It became judged by the price tag. So here are some of our contemporary collectors. Charles Saatchi, he's a British businessman worth an estimated $192 million. You'll see that's peanuts compared to some of the other ones. With his brother, he headed the largest advertising firm in the world. He bought his first painting when he was 26 in 1969. He collected Sol DeWitt, so he had a pretty good eye even at 26. He later championed the young British artists, and he was the one who helped launch Damien Hirst. So he had a pretty good eye for new art. He wrote a book called My Name is Charles Saatchi, and I Am an Artaholic. So he had an exhibit. This was also another new step in collecting. He had an exhibit called Sensation. It was in 1997. And this really raised the question of who curates art and who decides what is art. This was the big raging battle that happened after this, or during this Sensation show. He chose the art, Saatchi. He financed and underwrote the show, and he installed it at public museums, not curators, he as the collector, in London, Berlin, and Brooklyn. So he was criticized for taking over the curating part of these shows, but he was also criticized for the content. The protests erupted over this show for 2 paintings particularly. In the London portion, in the European portion, people were outraged that they depicted child killer Myra Hindley. The painting was made with tiny, she was a child killer, and they made it, her portrait was made with tiny children's hands, and people were outraged. And the other one, this one, the artist Chris Ofi, I think how you pronounce it, his painting went fine in Europe, but when it came over to the United States, in Brooklyn, that erupted here over religious reasons because he used elephant dung in this portrait of the Virgin Mary. So the question became a big question of, well, what is art, and who gets to say what art is? Another contemporary collector is Eli Broad. He was called by the Los Angeles Times the Lorenzo de Medici of Los Angeles. He is a real estate and insurance mogul. I told you that the price of, the net worth of these collectors is rising greatly. He's worth $7.2 billion. With his wife Edith, he creates the Broad Art Foundation. As I said, this was very common that they would start to create foundations, and within the foundations, it would be the foundation that would be collecting the art. Their art collection is worth $2.2 billion. They founded in 2015, last year, the Broad, which is a contemporary art museum in downtown LA. It features more than 2,000 pieces of post-war and contemporary art. That is the term that now is used. Modern art usually ends at, as I said, 1960, but now oftentimes scholars will start to talk about post-war and contemporary art. So these overlap, and the collectors themselves don't necessarily stick to one period. So you'll see some of them are still collecting some of the older art. Older meaning the 20th century. So this is 2,000 works of art. The building itself is a $140 million building. As I told you, that this has now become important for collections to be housed in beautiful buildings. The building itself becomes a work of art. Then we have Alice Walton, who's been dubbed the richest woman on earth. She's the heiress to the Walmart fortune. Her net worth is $33.2 billion. So she's upping the ante. She purchased her first piece of art at age 10. It was a reproduction of Picasso's Blue Nude, bought at her father's dime store. So she was an early collector. She, in 2011, opened the Crystal Bridges Museum, again, another beautifully constructed building in Arkansas. So it's the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, Bentonville, Arkansas. And in 2004, she bought $20 million worth of art at a single auction while she was atop her 3-year-old gelding. She was training for a horse competition. So she was on her phone buying $20 million worth of art. So I found this couple, I thought this is fascinating. This is a Chinese couple. You can see they're at Christie's. He is a former taxi driver, and he made billions in the stock market. They collected over 2,300 pieces, including works by Jeff Koons and Kusama. And they have built and filled 2 museums in China with contemporary art, and a 3rd one is on the way. He became extremely famous for 2 reasons. One is in 2015, he bought Modigliani's Nuit Couchée at an auction for $152 million. He also became famous because he doesn't just collect modern art. He collected a Ming teacup, and people were shocked that he served tea with it because they thought that was irreverent. I thought it was pretty practical. He used my husband's always telling me I should use my mother's china, so. David Geffen, now he isn't as rich, but he's very, he's not worth as much, but his collection is pretty amazing. He's a Hollywood producer and film studio executive. His art collection is worth an estimated $2.3 billion, or nearly a 1/3 of his total net worth of $7 billion. So not much money, but he spends a lot of it on art. And Carol Bayer Sager did his portrait. There he is sitting in his kitchen, maybe, with a Jackson Pollock that he sold, combined with a de Kooning for $277 million. Now, if you think this is amazing, wait, because at the end of my talk, I'm going to give you an update on the latest. But that was back in 2006. Okay, now I tossed these in because I think these are interesting. They're not necessarily the greatest collectors, but they're celebrities, and celebrities are fueling a lot of interest in modern art and contemporary art. So Leonardo DiCaprio collects Basquiat, Ruscha, Shore, Ryden, Walton Ford. He also collects Dali and Takashi Murakami. Madonna, her art holdings are worth $100 million, I mean. There she is in her living room, and I think that's a Legere up there over the fireplace. She collects a lot of women artists, specifically Frida Kahlo and Art Deco portraitist Tamara de Lempicka, but she also collects Warhol, Haring, and Basquiat. She's kind of been attributed to her the revival of interest in Frida Kahlo. Not that she ever wasn't interesting, but interest in collecting her. And then I found this one was interesting because CHEECH, as in Cheech and Chong, for those of you who remember that, he championed Chicano art. And this was interesting because these last 2 that I'm going to talk about are celebrities, but they have decided to kind of focus their art collecting. And in Cheech's cases, he wanted to champion Chicano art. Some art critics have said the art isn't, that it's mixed. It's a mixed bag, that he doesn't have the real eye for it, that he's just collecting it because it's, no matter what, it's Chicano. But I think it's really amazing that he's promoting art that was completely overlooked. And he's exhibited his collections at museums, including the LA County Museum of Art. So his name was able to put a lot of people to the forefront that wouldn't be paid attention to. The other person that I really admired when I looked into his collecting background was Steve Martin. Now, Steve Martin, as you recall, was the person who wrote that book about art early on, where the collector was not so flatteringly portrayed, which I thought was really interesting since he himself is an art collector. And it was the book showed that he knew very well the art collecting world and maybe even had a little bit of fun with himself as an art collector. He has hosted exhibits of his works by Picasso, Seurat, Bacon, Freud, and Hockney. So he's all over the map when it comes to different periods. He sold an Edward Hopper for $26.8 million. So he's up there in the price ranges. But the most interesting is this Canadian artist that he likes, Lauren Harris. And currently, there's an exhibit that he's hosting that is now at the MFA in Boston and will be in Ontario. So he's very active in working with museums. And the work of, I'd never heard of this guy, and the work is just magnificent. It's landscapes of Canada. And Steve Martin says, collecting art is my biggest hobby. This art is so different from what I do that it's an escape for me. Now, I wanted to get to, we do have art collectors among us. First, the first category is an art collector provides a body of work for a single show at a local museum. These are not local artists. Collectors. They're collectors who come and contract with a local museum for a show. The first example is Paul and Anna Belinda Feroce. He founded the Hotel Data Systems, and it's a reservation software company. He sold that and founded a museum in Greece, in Athens, with the express purpose of showing his wife and his collections. They collect Escher, Vasily, and Toulouse-Lautrec. And they brought their Escher collection to the Dali Museum. Some of you must have seen that. That's our Peter Tush showing off, showing off one of the pieces. And he came and gave a talk about collecting and talked about how impassioned he was about collecting and how crazy it made him and how he couldn't stop, and he wanted to, every time he wanted to try to stop, there would be one more for him to get. So he's another person who got very interested in a particular artist. Then there's Robert Flynn Johnson. He's the curator he's a curator in San Francisco. He collects, I think this is very interesting, he doesn't collect any one artist, he collects a kind of art, which he collects portraits and self-portraits. And this is, of course, another painting of him by an artist, Josephine Coniglio. And he brought his collection to the MFA. Some of you may have seen this one. It was Contemplating Character. And here are some of the pieces from that collection, including a Alfred Hitchcock self-portrait. He said about that collection, every drawing in this exhibit has moved me deeply in some human way and is both my conviction and hope that individuals who view this exhibition will make a similar connection. He also had his portrait painted or sketched by Roy Ward Ragel in this. The piece was in the collection. Then we have an art collector who donates a specific work to a local museum's permanent collection. And here's an example of that, Lothar and Mildred Yule. I'm sure some of you know Lothar often comes to the Dali. I don't see him here today, but he contributed a Picasso print. The Lipa Radner Museum in 2013 hosted a show of Françoise Gillot, Picasso's mistress or wife at one point. And she was an artist in her own right, and she exhibits. She's still alive, and they had an exhibit. And in conjunction with that, they had some Picasso prints in their collection. They put up a Picasso in print, and Lothar and Mildred Yule collect from their collection. They contributed to that exhibit, and then 3 years later, they donated the entire print collection to the museum. So the Lothar and Mildred Yule print collection now belongs to the Lipa Radner. And the other example is Jim and Martha Sweeney. No, those are not pictures of Jim and Martha Sweeney. That's a picture of the Guerrilla Girls who came to Mark's Maid, which was a print show at the MFA. And I want to stop a little bit to explain that this is a very unusual way to collect. Because when Jim took me around to show me this exhibit, I said, well, so which one of these did you have hanging in your house? And he said, well, none of them. And I said, "Ooh, I don't understand." And he said, well, because I never had these prints. What I did was I donated money specifically for them to buy women printmakers. It was earmarked for that. And Jim consulted with curators, sometimes actually going along to the studios of the printmakers. Sometimes the curators just went ahead and bought the prints without Jim, but Jim participated in picking some of these prints. And so almost every single print that was in that show was due to his donation and to his idea of buying more women printmakers. So it's an interesting way he is a collector, because it's not a person who just donated money and say, do what you want with that. He is specifying a certain type of collection, but he himself never actually puts it over his fireplace like Madonna. Then an art collector's private collection forms the basis for a local museum. That's another category that we have here. And I think we know the most famous one. And 1982, Eleanor and Reynolds Morse moved their Cleveland-based Dali collection to a former Marine storage house on Bayboro Harbor in St. Petersburg. And then on 1/11/11 at 11:11 a.m., the museum opened here. So that's the story of their collection and how it came here. The Lipa Radner was also due to a donation, a one-time donation by a family. Alan and Isabel Lipa, they donated more than 5,000 objects, including paintings by Ratner, Gentle, and Lipa, to the St. Petersburg College, and that became the Lipa Radner Museum. And that also included prints and works on paper and contemporaries of Ratner: Picasso, Chagall, Rouault, Léger, and Henry Moore. And of course, as the Dali Museum added after that original base donation by the Morses, so has the Lipa Radner. But the bulk is by one collector. And we have two museums coming up that form that same basis. The American Arts and Crafts Movement Museum, which will be opened in 2017. Now, arts and crafts is not exactly the period I'm covering, but the Rome-born Rudy Ciccarello, a Tarpon Springs businessman, he began buying these arts and crafts pieces, but he also collected 20th century photography, and including Alfred Stieglitz. So those fall into our modernist period. It's a collection of 1,300 works valued between $40 and $50 million. And again, it's owned by a foundation, same pattern that we've been seeing, a non-for-profit foundation. The other museum that's about to be opened is the Museum of Western and Wildlife Art. That's to open also in 2017. These are both downtown museums. This is from the collection of Tom James, the executive chairman of Raymond James Financial. James began collecting when he was a student at Harvard. He and his wife Mary collect Florida painters and sculptors, and their collection of over 2,500 pieces, valued between 20 and 25 million, is now housed at the Raymond James headquarters. But 600 of those pieces will be displayed in the new museum. So, what does it take to become an art director? Now you're tempted to say that that's what it takes, lots and lots of money. But as we saw with the two local collectors that I pointed out, they collected prints, and prints are always going to be a little bit less expensive and more affordable to the collector. Not saying that that you can be homeless and be a collector. I don't know. I think the days of the VOGELS may be over. But if you find somebody new, and this is what the early collectors did. They found these people starving in the Bateau Louvre, Vollards did. You can still buy artists cheap, but you have to have a very good eye and a lot of nerve. Just to give you an idea of how the art world has changed in terms of the masters of the modernist period. In 1987, Vase with 15 Sunflowers by Vincent van Gogh, which was that should be 1888, not 1988, which was painted in 1888, sold for $39.7 million. It was the first modern painting to become a record holder. Before that time, before 1987, the most expensive paintings that people would auction for would be masters, you know, a Rembrandt or something like that. This was the beginning of that period starting to hold an enormous value in the marketplace. I figured that out. That's more than $2.6 million per sunflower. So in 2015, Qatar Museums bought the Paul Gauguin's. Now again, we're talking about that early modernist period because Gauguin was a contemporary of Cézanne. When Will You Marry? The Qatar Museums bought that painting for close to $300 million. And at that time, they said that was the record, except that a few months later, they didn't know this because this had just been revealed this year, that David Geffen had sold another William de Kooning called Interchange. You see the painting there now. And another Jackson Pollock. He sold it to billionaire developer Ken Griffin, who's a Chicago developer, for $500 million, the two paintings. So the de Kooning went for $300 million, or they say approximately $300 million. So this is still considered probably the most expensive amount of money paid for a painting yet. And he's probably sold the Pollock for approximately $200 million. It was a private sale, so they didn't have to disclose what exactly it was. The good news is that these paintings are at the Art Institute of Chicago. So Griffin bought them so that they could be displayed in his hometown at that museum. But those are pretty astronomical prices. And then just last month, at the post-war and contemporary art evening sale, as I told you, that's the term now used for most of the art from the after-war till now. Sales were down a whopping 52% from last year. So does that mean that the art market is finally coming to its senses of having more affordable prices? I don't think so, because it represented a sale of $318.4 million. And many artists at that sale broke their own records. So the prices for artwork is still pretty much in the stratosphere. And during that same sale, an untitled canvas by Basquiat, which sold 12 years ago for $4.5 million, sold at that sale for $57.3 million. So somebody made a pretty good profit in a pretty short period of time. So what does it take to become an art collector besides money? Well, here's the good news. When I looked through this, when I did this, prepared this presentation, art collectors, even in that stratosphere, even the ones who are, maybe the Chinese taxi driver is only buying things because of the label. But many of the others really are discerning collectors. They're not, they do have a lot of money and they're turning them over. And you're tempted to say, oh, they're just doing it for the money. But when you think about it, they could probably do a lot of other things for the money. The art world is not a sure thing. You certainly can't, it's a risky investment. So the people involved in it really do have to love it. They do have to really love the art. And for the most part, they're not putting it like Gordon Gekko away in vaults just to sell it again. And to the Chinese couple's credit, they're creating art museums that are going to be open free to the public. So their purposes are not necessarily greedy or just greedy speculators. They do really love this art. It's just that we're at the point where it takes a little bit more money to get it. So I want to leave the last word to Robert Flynn Johnson about what it takes to be an art collector. It is not the qualities of knowledge, judgment, or that elusive term taste, but the ability to be curious that is the crucial element in the makeup of a true collector. The ability to ask questions, to learn, and to get answers regarding works of art that catch your eye and move your emotions. So still, collecting is all about the eye and about the heart. So that's my talk. If you would like to ask me any questions. I'd be glad to answer.